I just want to say a warm welcome to everyone who's joined us this evening for tonight's webinar. It's the first for me. I'm part of the training team, and usually we campaign it. We're telling people about how to campaign, how to knock on doors or have telephone calls. But tonight is something really different, and I'm really being proud to be part of this as well. It's the most amount of people we've ever have signed up to a webinar on this, so it shows how important it is. So really, we'll get a lot out of tonight's session. So thanks a lot for joining us. We're joined tonight. You're not going to hear much from me as part of the training team. We've got an excellent panel of Louise Haigh MP, Professor John Tong, Lord Paul Murphy, and Lord Alf Dubs as well, who all have contributed and will be contributing towards this Good Friday Agreement Pathway to Peace process that we've put on together. So you will not be hearing much from me, but you will be hearing a lot from them in tonight's session as well. Just a few little house rules of what's happening tonight and how to sort of get your voice heard as well. If you've got a question, can you please pop it in the Q&A? If there's other general chat that you've got, please use the chat box. We have got the team there who are monitoring that and who are going to be answering some of your questions as well. The session will be recorded tonight and will be available at the beginning of next week on our Good Friday Agreement website at labour.org.uk/GFA. So please do look out for that as well. The session will last an hour. As I say, it will be recorded and you can download the slides again on Monday as well. So please do look out for that as well. And also on that site, you can sign up for the future sessions that we've got coming up in February, March and April as well. So just before we do get into it a little bit more, we've just got two questions for you as well. I'm going to open up some of our polling and we just want to find out a little bit about you as well. So the first question that we've got is, let us when were you born at the time of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998? So please answer that, and we'll give you about 30 seconds or so as well. So that's be good to hear that and just get to know our audience a little bit as well. And with nearly 85% of people voted already, we can see that 94% of you were born at the time of the Good Friday Agreement back in 1998, but 7% were not born as well. So at least we know a little bit more about our audience. Our second poll is moving that one on, is how much do you know about the agreement as well? Do you think you have a good knowledge, fairly good knowledge, average, or not a lot as well? You're answering these polls very quickly as well. We're back up to 90% of people have responded so far, with 8% of people saying that they have a good knowledge, 23% saying that they have a fairly good knowledge, 44% are average, and 25% are not a lot. So thanks a lot for that as well. That just gives us a little bit more of an idea as well. So thanks a lot for taking part in that as well. So without much further ado, I'm going to hand over to Louise Haigh MP, who's our Shadow Secretary for Northern Ireland, who's going to take us through the first part of tonight's session. So over to you, Louise.
Well, thanks so much, Paul, and thanks to all the staff at the party and in my team that have helped facilitate today. And thank you all so much for joining. It's fantastic to see so many of you signed up, and I hope there'll be lots more watching back as these sessions continue over the coming months. An enormous thank you to John Tong, who's an eminent professor on the Good Friday Agreement and on all things Anglo-Irish relations. And we're really, really pleased to have him on board and leading these sessions with us. And a huge thank you, of course, to Lord Alf Dubs and Lord Paul Murphy, who were inspiring figures through the times of the Good Friday Agreement negotiations and since in implementing it, and we're at the front line of the last Labour government in ensuring that the peace was achieved and then implemented. So it's wonderful that they'll be helping us in this webinar today and talking about their experience. It's one of the most subscribed training events Labour has ever had, and I think that's a real testament to the enduring desire of people across these islands to learn and understand our history and the Good Friday Agreement's place in our current political debate. I think it also says a lot about members of our Labour Party and the desire to engage on a topic that is quite often, frankly, little understood in our political debate and in our history, but which all of us have a stake in better understanding. And I should say from the outset, though we only have an hour today, and that will limit questions, we really want you to be a part of this process. So please don't feel, if you don't get your question answered, that you're excluded. Please do send them over afterwards. With over 500 members on the call today, it will be difficult to answer them all, but we'll make sure that all of them are responded to. This is also the first of 4 webinars that we are doing, so there'll be plenty of opportunity to get involved if you don't manage to this evening. The Good Friday Agreement Education Programme will chart the path to peace that we'll be looking at today, the women and trade unionists who are at its heart, and what peace has meant for a new generation of young people in Northern Ireland. And as I say, it's a story that too often is not told. But today, an entire generation of people have grown up in Northern Ireland and are having children of their own, having known only peace. That is a phenomenal achievement of the last Labour government. And it's something we should celebrate, learn from, and defend. And it really is a unique programme, and we'll be hearing from people who have generously given their time to speak to us and who are at the heart of the agreement. As I've mentioned, really privileged to have Alf Dubs and Paul Murphy here tonight, but we'll also have Ava Cool-Murray and Monica McWilliams joining us in a later session, the co-founders of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition, and among the first women in the world to have ever had their names to an international peace treaty. We'll also hear from trade unionists from across Britain and Ireland, and young people from a diverse range of backgrounds who will also be joining us for discussion and reflection. Through all these sessions, as I've said, I'm delighted that we'll be joined by Professor John Tong from Liverpool University, who has played a key part in developing these programmes and the learning modules which accompany them. He's one of the UK and Ireland's leading experts on the agreement, and we're really lucky to have him on board. The programme is designed to be as inclusive as possible, so we'll be hearing voices representing all traditions in Northern Ireland. And that's really important to us in the Labour Party, because it's what the Good Friday Agreement was all about: bringing people together, respecting difference, and working together in the common good. And it's those principles that sustain it today. And it's also the reason the trade union movement in Britain and Ireland cherished the Good Friday Agreement, because it created a framework through which social justice could be pursued. And it's also worth remembering that the values which sustained it and made it popular are Labour values: peace, equality, diversity, inclusion, and solidarity. And I think it's also a story worth telling, because it's ultimately about what we believe and who we are. The Good Friday Agreement only worked because of a shared commitment to its core principles: respect for human rights, an inclusive understanding of citizenship, parity of esteem, and acceptance of the democratic right for the people of Northern Ireland to decide their own constitutional future. And throughout these sessions, we'll be exploring all those principles. The most important lesson I think I'd really like us all to take away and reflect on throughout these is the amount of work that is still left to be done in implementing the Good Friday Agreement. And that's what I held dearest to me as Shadow Secretary of State. There's still an awful lot of work to do on building the shared, better future that the great John Hume imagined in the dark days of conflict. From delivering a Bill of Rights to dealing with the legacy of the past to promoting integrated education and housing, none of this can be achieved without the principles of the Good Friday Agreement working across communities in Northern Ireland, and of course our co-guarantors to the agreement, the Republic of Ireland's government. So today we'll explore some of those areas. I should also say that I'm in Harrow Arts Centre today because I'm participating in Question Time later this evening, which coincidentally is a Northern Ireland special. So I'll be up against my opposite number, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, and the Deputy First Minister and the First Minister from Northern Ireland. So this isn't where I live. I am waiting to go on the Question Time panel later. So if you feel inspired by the webinar today, please do tune in later for a very contemporary discussion of all things Northern Ireland. But before further ado, we'll turn to John Tong, who will outline what the Good Friday Agreement set out to do, how it was achieved against all odds, from the Downing Street Declaration to the agreement itself, the referendum, the issues that remain to be overcome. And then we'll be pleased to hear the perspectives of Paul Murphy and Alf Dubs. So over to you, John. Thank you.
Thanks ever so much, Lou, and thank you to you and all your team for inviting me to contribute to this training resource for the Labour Party. It's a fantastic opportunity. I've really enjoyed doing it, and it's an important story. And as you say, the sheer number of people who've logged onto the webinar, I think, speaks volumes that there is a considerable amount of interest, a thirst for knowledge about the Good Friday Agreement. I sometimes think that the Labour Party can be a bit shy about trumping its achievements, and the Good Friday Agreement is right up there near the top of Labour's achievements. So there shouldn't be that shyness. The desire for knowledge is fantastic. What I want to do, moving on to the first slide, is give you an outline. And before panic sets in, I'm not going to go through a blow-by-blow history of the Good Friday Agreement. The point about the detail on this slide is to emphasise a few points. Firstly, that getting to peace is a hugely convoluted process. Anyone who thinks that the Good Friday Agreement fell easily needs to look again at history. The second point of this timeline is that I'm so glad that Paul Murphy and Alf Dubs are here, because they can correct me on any issues of detail, given that they were at the cutting edge of helping deliver peace. Third point to make is that most political deals in peace processes fail. It's worth remembering 55% of peace deals collapse within 2 years. The fact that we're here talking about the Good Friday Agreement more than 2 decades on speaks volumes about the wonders and the complexity of that deal that it has held together, certainly with some hiccups in terms of, power sharing. And then the fourth thing is the slide itself. I mean, just look how convoluted it is. And, I could have offered you 50 slides in terms of the complexity of detail. And I think the first item on the slide, the Sunningdale devolved power sharing deal, emphasises the difficulty in making political deals stick, because Sunningdale lasted a mere 5 months, even though it may have had considerable merit as a power sharing deal between Unionists and Nationalists in Northern Ireland. It collapsed amid a loyalist workers' strike almost as soon as it was born. And you had thousands of deaths as a consequence of that, both before and after Sunningdale. You had the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1985, which, rather like Sunningdale, didn't enjoy popular consent. And that's an important point to make about the Good Friday Agreement, that it enjoyed the will of the people. In terms of the peace process itself, it was a convoluted, long-term process. There isn't a fixed starting point for it. Historians and political scientists and ordinary Labour Party members and whoever will not agree necessarily on when the peace process started. Some people would argue that it started with a dialogue between John Hume, the late John, and much missed John Hume, and Gerry Adams in the late 1980s, in which John Hume was arguing for a method of self-determination for the people of Ireland that was agreeable to all the people on the island of Ireland. Then you had, and we should give the Conservatives some praise in terms of trying to lay the foundations for a peace process, where you had two Secretaries of State, Peter Brook and Patrick Mayhew, who did engage in dialogue with most of the political parties to try and move towards an agreement. And then you have really the move towards the Good Friday Agreement, the Downing Street Declaration of 1993, which I'll come back to on the next slide. And then you get the breakthrough in terms of Republican and Loyalist ceasefires. But there was still an awful lot for Tony Blair's government to do come 1997, because what he inherited was a collapsed IRA ceasefire, the biggest IRA bombs ever that have been detonated in London and Manchester in 1996. We still were a long way from peace at that point. And so the complexity of the Good Friday Agreement to put into practice some of the principles of the Good Friday Agreement, is quite something to behold. So, moving on to the Downing Street Declaration itself. The point about the declaration in laying the foundations for the Good Friday Agreement was that, there was an acknowledgement that the people on the island of Ireland had to determine their own future. So consent was at the heart of the declaration and the Good Friday Agreement. The second thing was that the British government was anxious to say it had no selfish strategic or economic interest in Northern Ireland. It was there in Northern Ireland on the basis of consent. So again, you see the theme of consent. The Irish government promised changes to its constitution, which it duly delivered in the Good Friday Agreement, more of which in a moment. And you got those ceasefires, albeit fragile, from Republicans and Loyalists. So when we move to the Good Friday Agreement itself and look at what it produced, we know, most of us will know about the three strands that are there within the deal. A very complex deal. It's a deal between political parties, and it's a deal between two governments registered at the United Nations, an international treaty, one of the most famous international treaties now, and one of the most admired. You know, there's a reason why John Hume and David Trimble, as the leader of unions at the time, won the Nobel Peace Prize, because they delivered on the ground. But it was more complex than that, obviously, because you had the British government involved, you had the Irish government delivering, and of course you had the US government playing a very, very important facilitator role, which I'll talk about in a second. But in terms of the three strands of the agreement, the first, that decisions for Northern Ireland should be taken by elected representatives within Northern Ireland. The devolution of powers to an elected assembly and power sharing executive required compromises from all the political parties. If you read Jonathan Powell's book, I'd recommend it, Great Hatred, Little Room. There were times when he and Tony Blair thought that they were never going to get an agreement on devolution. How to get there, how to get agreement between political parties, all of whom wanted different things, even if they agreed on the idea of devolving government to Northern Ireland. Then you've got the all-Ireland dimension, which was essential to nationalists, the North-South Ministerial Council and new cross-border bodies. And then you've got the linkage of devolved institutions and the British and Irish governments in strand 3. Let's not pretend that everyone lived happily ever after. That would be foolish. The Assembly and Executive have been missing 45% of the time since the Good Friday Agreement. That shows how difficult it is to broker power sharing. Most power sharing deals across the globe collapse. We should be thankful 21 years on that this agreement has held. In many ways, it is miraculous that we've had Stormont for more time than we haven't. And when it has been functioning, it has achieved some important things. For example, you've had the devolution of policing and justice to the Northern Ireland Assembly in 2010. So if we move to the next slide, some of the aspects of the Good Friday Agreement were obviously very, very contentious, but at the heart of it was that there would be no change in Northern Ireland's place in the United Kingdom without majority consent. It did not abandon the idea of a united Ireland, and the Good Friday Agreement is very, very clear that it is equally legitimate to aspire to a united Ireland as it is to want Northern Ireland's place in the United Kingdom, in the same way that the agreement makes very clear that it's equally legitimate to have a Protestant British or Unionist identity or a Catholic Irish nationalist identity. And I use those terms interchangeably, only very loosely. People may have only one or two of those identities. The point is, a border poll, the facility for a border poll was written into the agreement, and one may eventually take place. It depends upon the Secretary of State's reading of public opinion. So no change, but nonetheless consent written at the heart of the agreement. Secondly, the Irish government amended its constitution with overwhelming endorsement from its people to accept this. Then you had some hugely contentious aspects of the Good Friday Agreement, which the Labour government did very, very well to sell. And this is what makes the Good Friday Agreement, in my view, different from the Sunningdale Agreement, to which it is often compared in the 73-74 Sunningdale Agreement. You had a commission on policing, the Patton Commission, which led to the reform of the Royal Ulster Constabulary and the arrival of the police service of Northern Ireland, given the imbalance in composition that was present in the Royal Ulster Constabulary. You had controversial measures that followed from that, 50-50 Catholic and non-Catholic recruitment to the police force. You had a Human Rights Commission, and one of the reasons the Good Friday Agreement is very much a living document is we're still waiting for full implementation of some of the human rights aspects that are there within the Good Friday Agreement. You had an Equality Commission set up, and again, that is something where still further work is needed. Then you had the hugely controversial prisoner release scheme, in which everyone whose organisation was on ceasefire, all prisoners, would be released within 2 years. Often prisoner release schemes collapse other peace processes. The Good Friday Agreement, although this was a very controversial measure, at least offered clarity on the nature of the scheme, which again, controversial that it was, it's difficult to envisage the deal having been delivered if it hadn't been for that. But also that the Good Friday Agreement was conscious of the suffering of victims, and there are various items built in, still again, which still we have the outworking of that, things that protections for victims that are also built into the agreement, which are ongoing and have been updated, not always satisfactory, it should be said, by such things as the Stormont House Agreement. But at the heart of the agreement were those key themes that Lou mentioned them at the start. Parity of esteem. There'll be no more discrimination against one community. There would be equality between the two communities and beyond the two communities. And there would be consent for constitutional change. Point, and this is the final slide from me, the point about this, just moving on to that final slide, is popular endorsement. You know, for the Labour government to embark on a referendum for this was risky. Have a look at some other peace processes around the world that have used referenda. They've collapsed peace processes, or they've certainly hindered them. If you look at Colombia as one example, referendums can go wrong. The point about this, that Tony Blair decided and John Hume supported and Mo Mowlam wanted a referendum. They wanted popular endorsement for the deal because it would give the deal a clear legitimacy that would make it difficult to oppose. And if you look on a huge turnout, a very big yes vote for the Good Friday Agreement. It's true that nationalists were more enamored with it than newness, but overall, you see a clear mandate for it. And if you look at the referendum in the South, in the Irish Republic, again, albeit on a lower turnout, huge endorsement of those changes to Articles 2 and 3, which claim Northern Ireland. Again, not giving up on the United Ireland, but making those articles aspirational rather than an inbuilt claim. So the Good Friday Agreement, it's a hugely complex document. It might only be 38 pages, but it's very, very complex. And it's one of the most successful peace deals that you'll find anywhere in the world. On that basis, you know, I think Labour should trumpet it more, but it's great to see that so many people here tonight have logged on to find out more about it. Thank you very much.
I think we're now going to bring in Lord Paul Murphy for sharing his thoughts as well. So, Paul, over to you now.
Thank you very much indeed. Can you hear me? That's the first thing. Excellent. Mo Mowlam and myself came into the House of Commons together in 1987. We were great friends. And when Tony Blair became the leader of the opposition after John Smith's death, she asked me to become her Deputy Secretary of State, Shadow Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, which I did. And then eventually when we won the election in 1997, I became her deputy in real government. And my job was, first of all, as Minister of Finance, but mainly, and my title was the Minister for Political Development and Talks Minister. So I actually spent 2 years of my life talking and talking and talking. But remember, these talks were a very specially structured set of talks. They'd been set up by statute. People had been elected from the different political parties in Northern Ireland, including the Women's Coalition, incidentally, to represent them at the talks. And the talks process was held in an extremely dull, awful building called Castle Buildings in Belfast, near Stormont. And each party had an office. Each government, the British and Irish government, had offices, including myself. And everything happened in this particular block, old office block in Belfast. But of course, it wasn't really about blocks, was it? It was about people. Remember, by now, people in Northern Ireland were war-weary. 3,500 people had perished. Tens of thousands of people had been injured mentally and physically by the Troubles. And there was a feeling that we wanted now to have peace. But how do you do it? And the structure was such that the chairman, or the chair, was George Mitchell, Senator George Mitchell, former majority Democrat leader in the United States Senate, one of the most brilliant politicians I've ever met and known. He chaired it. He had two deputies, John de Chastrand and Harry Alcaria. One was the former Prime Minister of Finland. The other one was the former head of the Canadian Armed Forces. And they were the chair structure of these talks. But underneath that, we had, as John had said, three strands. Strand one, dealing with how you deal with the government within Northern Ireland, the power sharing, strand 2, North-South relations, and strand 3 between East and West, Britain and Ireland. It fell to me to chair strand 1 and half of strand 3 with the Irish government minister, Liz O'Donnell. So most of my time, but not all of it, was spent in dealing with how do you set up the assembly, what sort of election system do you have, how do you ensure proper power sharing, how do you involve people in it? Because initially, Sinn Féin didn't want to get involved in strand 1 at all, but eventually they did. But it was all about people. People being the Irish government, Bertie Ahern, the Taoiseach, brilliant politician, former minister responsible for negotiation with trade unions in the Irish government, couldn't have been better. Our own Prime Minister, Tony Blair, did a magnificent job in terms of bringing all this together. It was his mission in many ways. And then, of course, you had Bill Clinton and the Irish American senators, people like Ted Kennedy and others who were hugely involved in all this. And also, incidentally, the European Union. The fact that Ireland and Britain at that time, oh dear, looking back, were still part of the same club. And because we were able to work in a very special way within Europe, because ministers would meet in Brussels all the time between Dublin and London. And so all those different strands came together. And of course, above all else, the political parties in Northern Ireland as well. And if they hadn't changed in the way they did, there would never have been an agreement. The SDLP, our sister party, John Hume, Seamus Mallon, Mark Durkan, and all the others, brilliant at it. In fact, I think you can probably say that had it not been for the SDLP, had it not been for John Hume, no peace process, no political process, no settlement. It was he who started it above all else. Sinn Féin, with Gerry Adams, Martin McGuinness, and all their colleagues, changed their view, had to come now to a political consensus. And then on the Unionist side, the Ulster Unionist Party led by David Trimble, and the smaller Ulster Unionist parties as well, which were linked in some ways to the old paramilitary organizations on the loyalist sides. All these were vital. And if you imagine that when I went into these talks, many of these people simply weren't talking to each other. They'd been killing each other for 20 years, but now they were sitting next to each other. And it was my job to try and bring them all together again. And so it was about trust, it was about confidence, it was about relationships. And when we got eventually to Good Friday 1998, they were talking to each other. They were engaging with each other. They were talking about what we should do in the assembly, what we should do with this, what we should do about prisoner release, and all the rest of it. And involved in all this was the great Mo Mowlam, a woman of enormous energy, huge intelligence, very blunt, and now we know, of course, suffering from a brain tumor in all of this, and which she told me and others that was benign. It turned out in the end that it wasn't, but she did a magnificent job. And I think it was the fact, amongst many other things, that she was a woman. The Women's Coalition was unique in world political history in what they did. Mo brought something which stuffy old men secretaries of state like myself couldn't bring. And that was absolutely crucial to its success. We didn't think in the winter of 1997-98 we'd do it. There was a death a day, both sides, mainly Catholics, but Protestants as well. George Mitchell decided to put a deadline of Good Friday, 1998. That deadline concentrated the minds in that final week, Holy Week as it's called, before Good Friday. We went there not necessarily with the expectation we do it, but we worked through 2 nights. Alf, as a minister in Northern Ireland, and myself, we were heavily involved in this. Alf bringing together people as I was doing. He'll talk for himself in a minute about how all that happened. And then in the final night, I sometimes wondered even then whether we'd make it. But there was a point, for example, about 3 o'clock in the morning when John Hume and Reg Empley from the Unionists came to see me about how many members of the new assembly there should be. I suggested 108. They thought that was a good idea, and we had 108 members of the assembly. But they'd agreed to start dealing with the detail at that stage, because the other issues, the release of prisoners, the policing issues, the criminal justice, equality, human rights, and the relationships between North and South, all these were being settled. It didn't quite happen. As John said, read Jonathan Powell's book on the detail of what happened in those days and how overnight we managed to do it. And through in the day on Good Friday. And it wasn't until 5:30 on Good Friday in the afternoon, with George Mitchell chairing it, me and Tony and Mo sitting on the British side, everybody around the table, finally agreeing to the greatest, in my view, but I'd say it, wouldn't I, but the greatest political peace settlement of my lifetime, and indeed beyond that. And we did it. There wasn't a dry eye in the place, and nor should there have been. And when we'd had the referendum, Mo and I went to talk to the press in a huge hall in Belfast. And if there was one, there were 500 to 1,000 journalists there with their cameras. And I have never seen journalists, a hard-headed lot as they are, stand and applaud as they did when Mo announced what had happened and what we were going to do. And it was the beginning of a new era. But George Mitchell, when he finally spoke in that room on Good Friday 1998, quite rightly said, this is the beginning. It's not the end of the process. It took another 20 years before we've come to where we are now. It hasn't been very long ago when the assembly wasn't up and running and it was back to direct rule, but they are now. And it won't go back to those terrible days of death and destruction and misery. We've done it. It's taken a long time. I left Northern Ireland then in 1999 to become Welsh Secretary, but I returned 3 years later as Northern Ireland Secretary on one of the occasions when the Assembly and the Executive had collapsed over the issue of decommissioning of weapons. But the determination and the resilience of the people of Northern Ireland and their leaders pulled through. And that is why the Good Friday Agreement is the greatest achievement the Labour government, or indeed any Labour government, has done in our lifetimes. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Paul, for those contributions. I don't know what to say, but the only thing I can say is I'm going to pass over to Alf now, just to share his contributions as well. And after Alf has finished, then we'll do our best and answering the many questions that have come in there. So Alf, just over to you now.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. And thank you, Labour Party. Thank you, all of you who've organised this, because I agree very much with Paul. Paul and I became good friends while we were together in Belfast, but I agree very much with Paul and the others that this is the achievement of that Labour government. And I remember talking occasions, we had delegations from war-torn countries like Kosovo and so on, and we were talking about Northern Ireland. And suddenly their ears picked up because they realized the issues in Northern Ireland had some bearing on the problems in their own countries and the divisions and the sense of identity and so on. But I was asked to say just a little bit about myself and my involvement with Northern Ireland. So I'm not going to duplicate what Paul said so clearly or what John has said so clearly or Louise. I'm going to add a few personal reflections. And it really started off, I got the Tuesday after the election, I got a call from Tony Blair saying, would I go to Belfast? And suddenly my life changed. Got to Belfast, 2 close protection officers, bulletproof car and all that sort of stuff. But shortly afterwards, the civil servants, and I had 2 departments as well as the peace process and legislation in London. I had 2 departments, and the civil servants came to me and they said, we didn't know that you lived in Northern Ireland. And it's all a quaint little story. But I came as a refugee from Czechoslovakia as a tiny child at the age of 6. And for reasons which are odd, my father, who escaped before me, he was Jewish, he'd been offered a job in Northern Ireland. And we went off to Northern Ireland. He then had a heart attack and died there. But with my mum, I spent about 3 years in Cookstown, and the civil servants were quite amazed and said, why didn't you tell us? And I said, well, 2.5, 3 years in Cookstown at the age of 6 is not enough to claim Northern Ireland credentials, but it's too long to deny. Yes, I was there. Anyway, while I was in the Commons, I'd frequently visited Northern Ireland and indeed Dublin, and I'd met John Hume, Seamus Mallon, Martin McGuinness, David Trimble, all the people there, Mark Durkin. I'd met them all. I had an advantage. I knew them all from way back. I'd met Seamus Mallon and John Hume at Labour Party conference meetings and so on. Anyway, so I got to Belfast, and within a few days, Tony Blair came over to make his first major speech as Prime Minister. It was in Belfast. It was at the Balmoral Centre. And he made the speech about the peace process. And I remember I was sitting about a few feet away from him, dramatic occasion. And he said, the peace train is leaving. And he said to Sinn Féin, if you don't get on board, the peace train will leave without you. A dramatic occasion. And it set the tone for Tony Blair's enormous commitment to the peace process. It's just so dramatic. One felt it. And of course, the whole world then pitched in, whether it was Bertie Ahern, it was a Taoiseach, or whether it was George Mitchell, as Paul's referred to, or Bill Clinton came over, Hillary Clinton came over, the EU, everything. It was almost the centre of the world for that time. And I was sitting in Mo's office, the phone would go to Madeleine Albright from Washington, or somebody from Brussels. It was really the centre of the world. And we felt there was something positive. And I always felt sorry in that respect for those ministers in previous governments who'd simply been there to contain the terror, whereas we were there to move forward, and that gave us a very positive sense. And we had great evenings chatting. Paul and others were chatting in the evenings, talking about all these things that happened. I'm not saying bad things didn't happen, because even after the ceasefire, we had the Omagh bombing, we had various tragedies in Points Pass and so on. Nevertheless, there was a sort of a positive sense about overall, and we were optimistic. And Mo made that dramatic visit to the Maze to talk to some of the loyalist paramilitaries. She was advised not to Bavare's people, but she went into the Maze. It was a brave thing to do because the peace process at that point was in jeopardy, and she held it together and she did it. And that was a really brave thing to do. And underpinning all this were the good relationships we had particularly with the Irish government. I mean, Bertie Ahern's Taoiseach was magnificent, and I had some dealings with some of the other Irish ministers, and the Irish were totally supportive of what we're doing. And I mean, I used to go to European Council meetings in Brussels occasionally, and Joe Walsh, one of the Irish government ministers, backing us. He was so backing us. He was so supportive. It was quite exhilarating. And of course, at weekends, I stayed on duty weekends. I stayed in Hillsborough Castle, which was a bit unusual for me. But it was nice to have a little castle. Castles live in Pulse had duty weekends there as well. And one little thing that struck me during all this, I was back in London. Glad to be back in London for a bit, and I was driving along past some council flats in Paddington, and I saw it was the middle of the World Cup, and both England and Ireland were doing well. And on a balcony of a council estate, there was a Union Jack and an Irish tricolour from the same balcony. And I thought to myself, there's a good lesson for Northern Ireland. I wish I'd taken a photograph showing these two could coexist. It was quite dramatic, and it was very positive. And of course, I remember the castle buildings, very bleak buildings, and that long night, and the snow was outside, and there were difficulties. At one point, I saw Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness walking out. I said, "Hey, Rashad, you're not leaving? You're not?" No, it's all right. We're not leaving. I said, "You better not." It was really dramatic, and Paul has described it extremely well. And I remember there were other occasions as well. When the Patton report came out, which Mo accepted, which was to increase the number of Catholics in the police by having 50-50 recruitment, and we're worried about how this would go down. And so Mo sent all her ministerial team to various police stations. Now I had two police close protection officers with me. So I got to the police station in Enniskillen, and my police close protection officers were shrewd guys. And they looked in and they saw 25 police officers all there to listen to me about the process. And the police weren't happy about it. In the end, they accepted it. But we walked into this room in the police station in Enniskillen, and one of my police guys says, every Catholic police officer in Fermanagh sitting in this room had really done it just to impress upon me about the small number of Catholic police officers, but who were worried about the Patton agreement. But the Patton report was accepted, and that was absolutely terrific. And then, of course, there was all the legislation in the Lords to get the peace process embedded, to get the devolution settled. That was quite a long haul. And Paul mentioned, I'm nearly finishing, Paul mentioned the prisoner release scheme. that was a very difficult piece of legislation. There were several former Northern Ireland secretaries, Tories, and a Labour one, in the Lords, and they were quite critical of the prisoner release. Well, some of them were quite critical of the prisoner release scheme, and we had to sell it. We got it scraped through by a very 4 votes, I think it scraped through, which was really touch and go, because although it could have been overturned in the Commons, it would have had a very bad effect on public opinion in Northern Ireland if it had been defeated. But it went through, and that was quite a positive thing. In fact, I'll tell you, I'll finish off by saying this: the leader of the Tories then made his speech opposing this totally, and he looked at me and he made a threat, and he said he hoped I wasn't going to be killed by terrorists, which was a bit of a threat. And I muttered a bit and said I could look after myself, I think. However, interestingly enough, several Tory peers came up to me afterwards and said, had he not said that, they'd have voted against the Labour government's proposals. But because of that, they abstained. So thanks to his threat in the chamber in the Lords, we got this difficult bit of legislation through. So I feel very proud and privileged to have been there. I think it was a fantastic time to be there. I had wonderful colleagues, and I think it made a mark. And we must not, as Labour Party members, forget what happened and what a tremendous contribution to peace was created by that Labour government.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alf, and thank you everyone so far. We're right on time at the moment, so now is the bit for questions. And so I'm just going to throw these out to all of our panelists. So if you possibly all come off mute, and then we can see who wants to answer it. So the first question that we've got is coming from Ella, and it is Ella's question is, why was Brexit and border discussed so often in relation to the Good Friday Agreement? What was its significance?
At the time.
Shall I kick that off, Paul?
Yes, please.
Because I think that's a really important question, and that's actually a big part of the reason why we wanted to do this training, because obviously the Good Friday Agreement and the consequences of Brexit to the agreement have been so prevalent in the last few years, and they remain very pertinent with the implementation of the protocol and the disruption you'll have seen in the news of the trading arrangements between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So thank you for that question. And it's important because the word border doesn't actually appear anywhere in the 35 pages of the Good Friday Agreement, because we were all in the European Union at the time, as Paul said. And that open border really helped facilitate the Good Friday Agreement. It was a key assumption made by everyone who signed it, and a hard land border obviously was loaded with historical significance. And that border, as I'm sure most of you on the call will know, is an incredibly porous one. It has over 200 crossings between Northern Ireland and the Republic across a 310-mile frontier. There's now more crossings into the European Union on that border than is on the entire eastern side of the border of the European Union. So the idea of there being any kind of return to a border or checks and controls along there was obviously something to be avoided at all costs, and it's why the Labour Party campaigned against any form of deal that would have led to it. And that's why the protocol, the Irish protocol, was then negotiated and agreed on. It was to avoid that border on the island of Ireland. Unfortunately, it has meant that there are increased checks and controls in between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And that's just as important in terms of the identity and respect for community central to the Good Friday Agreement as avoiding that border on the island of Ireland is. And so it's really important that we in the Labour Party are just as sensitive and seek to minimise any disruption or the impact on the everyday lives of people in Northern Ireland that occur because of the protocol, because that ability and the respect of people to live their lives north-south just as much as east-west was a fundamental princess, and that's what's a fundamental principle, and that is what has secured the peace and guaranteed stability in Northern Ireland.
Can I add that the common membership of the European Union of Ireland and the United Kingdom was enormously significant. I was European Minister as well in 1997, and towards the end of my time there, after we had the Good Friday Agreement and the Assembly had been elected, I took the entire Assembly to Brussels, all of them, because they'd been invited to see how Europe had contributed towards the success of the agreement. I had money. There was a huge peace process grant given by the European Union to Northern Ireland, the peace process. But the condition of the grant was that both sides, Unionist and Nationalist, Catholic and Protestant, had to sit together to work out how the money was spent. And that was an enormous significance in bringing people together. And of course, the fact that the governments were spending time together in Brussels and elsewhere in that same club. No, the European Union was pivotal to the success of the Good Friday Agreement. And as Louisa said, the border issue was central to the Good Friday Agreement as well.
Thank you, Paul. I'm just trying to get through these. So the second one, I think, is probably more one for you, John. It's from Richard. What work is still to do to deliver on its promises / deliver full implementation?
Okay, there's several aspects. One is victims, satisfactory, I won't say compensation, but addressing the needs of victims. You've had, if you like, successor mini agreements like the Stormont House Agreement, trying to address issues of truth and justice, because you've not had a comprehensive system like you had in South Africa, for example, where you had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So the needs of victims have still not properly been addressed. So that's a key area. The second is issues of integration, because one of the criticisms that they sometimes offer of the Good Friday Agreement is it didn't have a plan to reintegrate fully Northern Ireland. And issues like integrated education, slowly that's going on, but we're still only just at 10% of schools in Northern Ireland or 10% of pupils, I should say, going to integrated schools. So there is a need to reintegrate, and that's broader than education. It's about, what are the peace walls? At some point, are they going to come down? Is there an executive plan in place to remove those peace walls, given that a lot of people who live near them still say that they would feel a little bit uneasy if they were taken down? So reintegration, needs of victims, and the third, which I did mention in the talk, was a Bill of Rights, a designated Northern Ireland Bill of Rights, was still lagging behind in terms of addressing issues of what to do about rights. So I think there's three core areas, all of which need, if you like, constant attention.
Could I just add, by endorsing very much what John's just said, there are legacy issues like what we do about Finucane, having a full inquiry. There are legacy issues like that we just drag on, which have got to be dealt with. And again, integrated education, it's something very dear to my heart. Under 10% of the kids in Northern Ireland go to integrated schools. They are a wonderful educational achievement, and anything I've tried all my life to push that, and certainly in recent years, it's moving forward, but too slowly.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm trying to get through these as well. This is Paul. I think you touched upon this a little bit earlier with Colombia. Liam's asked, what lessons can be learned for other conflicts around the world?
Yes, in fact, I've been around the world on a number of occasions, talking to countries which wanted to try and adopt the Northern Ireland peace process solution. I went to Sri Lanka, where I spectacularly failed, because they didn't. They listened carefully, but in the end, the military took over and there was a terrible war there. I went to the Middle East to talk to them there in Palestine about it, and they listened and they thought some of the ideas were good. But the one I think where they did really take notice was in the Philippines, where in the south of that country, there was a conflict between the Muslim community and the Christian community. And they took a huge interest in Northern Ireland and the way we structured our talks, in the way we had to have parity of esteem between both sides. And the principles which lay at the foundation of how we dealt with the talks can in fact be transferred to other countries and have been, not completely, but there are ways in which we can teach people, and happily, for example, when I went to Sri Lanka, Martin McGuinness had gone there a couple of weeks before that. A lot of the people involved, like John Alderdice and other people who've been the Speaker of the Northern Ireland Assembly, do go around the world to those areas which still have conflicts and tell them how we achieve what we did in Northern Ireland. Not a complete fit, but a help.
Brilliant. Another question here, I think this is for you, Louise. To what extent did the grassroots community and cross-community initiatives contribute to the peace? And that's from Steve.
That's again a really important aspect that I'm hoping that we can explore in one of the upcoming sessions about the role of trade unionists and those grassroots initiative. I was really pleased to visit on my first trip as Shadow Secretary of State the Shankill Road and the Falls Road women's centres, and was just so struck about the amazing cross-community work that they've been doing on the ground in the decades in the run-up to the Good Friday Agreement and since. So I think that's why we've really wanted to focus on those aspects, really, because the amazing work, obviously, that politicians did through the talks is well told and well recorded. But this has been a secure, a sustainable and a secured peace process because it had the support finally of the people in Northern Ireland. And I noticed that someone mentioned earlier on the chat that Seamus Mallon described the Good Friday Agreement as Sunningdale for slow learners. That's absolutely right. A lot of the principles were very similar, and those principles and agreements had been tabled on several occasions through the decades in relation to Northern Ireland, but because of a sustained political attention and political will from the Labour government, but also because the people in Northern Ireland and those the work on the grassroots created the conditions that allowed the peace to come and the peace to be successful and enduring.
Question now in from Sally. She's put in the Q&A and in the chat, so I was very keen for it to get answered, and I think it's might be more for John, but his views on how well does the power sharing work?
It has worked well at times, but it's also been obviously fraught with difficulty at other times. I think you've had two phases of power sharing. The first was where some of the conflict ending measures really dogged power sharing. So rows about decommissioning dogged the first phase of power sharing. There's no getting away from that. And in 2002, the Assembly and Executive did collapse. There was that, the unionists wanted no guns, no government. And the IRA didn't fully decommission until 2005. So it was unstable. There's no getting away from that. Then you had the St Andrews Agreement to sort of, I won't call it a bolt on, but it sort of was to the Good Friday Agreement. And you had the restoration in 2007. You had then a period which I think is underestimated in terms of the stability of power sharing government, which may elicit some guffaws from cynics. But actually, you had the devolution of policing and justice, and you had the initial Chuckle Brothers phase between with Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness, and an unlikely coming together, followed by a very pragmatic and effective working relationship between Peter Robinson and Martin McGuinness, which was quite effective. And then obviously you had the problems of Brexit, RHI and other things, which downed the Assembly in 2017. It's back now, and I think, at the risk of tempting fate, I don't see it going away. All parties are committed to making this work, even though there are ongoing difficulties. I mean, what do we seriously expect? There's parties in there with very different constitutional ambitions. They're not going to agree on the constitution, but they can agree on the day-to-day running of Northern Ireland. And I think we have to give them some credit for that. Going back to, it was a point that Paul made, that you're bringing together parties, people literally were trying to kill each other 2 decades ago. Getting them together was a miracle. So yes, it's been unstable, but also it has made progress as well.
Thanks, John. And that does sort of take us on to the next question, which is a really good one there. And I think it's more for Paul and Alf on this one. It's from Keith saying, was there ever a time when you believed it would fall apart, or did you always have faith?
I always had faith because of talking to what you might call ordinary men and women in the street in Northern Ireland, who kept wishing us well even in the worst of times. And there was hardly a family, in Northern Ireland which hadn't been affected violently in some way or other by the Troubles. And so you had faith in yourself that you were doing a job that had to be successful. But yes, there were low times. I explained earlier on that the winter of 97-98 was particularly awful because of the murders. And also, of course, after the Good Friday Agreement was signed, when I had to come back from holiday in France to witness the horrors of the Omagh bombing. And that was absolutely horrendous and gut-wrenching. And so, yes, there were times when you felt everything was going wrong, but there was always the big picture. And it was the big picture all the time you kept on thinking about. Let's carry on with this despite what dreadful things that was happening around us. And in the end, it worked.
Yeah, there were, of course, there were bad moments, and Paul's mentioned one. There was that shooting at Points Pass, dreadful shooting, because a Catholic and Protestant man were in a pub together, and somebody came in and shot them both. Dreadfully depressing. But on the other hand, we had to believe in the peace process because we saw there was no other way forward for the people of Northern Ireland. If we didn't believe in the peace process, we were saying to them, you don't matter, you can just go on having this terrible life. And we believed that we had to improve the life for people in Northern Ireland. I think that's what kept us going.
Okay, I'm going to try and squeeze in one question. Linda, we're not going to take your question on the Women's Coalition because we've got a whole session on that coming up in our future webinars. And I'm just wondering, this is probably another one for Paul and Alf before I hand over to Louise, but I really like this one. How important was the meeting of minds between Paisley and McGuinness? And that was from John.
Came later, of course. It didn't happen to begin with. I mean, there was a long time where not only would they not shake hands, but they would not speak to each other, literally wouldn't speak to each other. And that's quite hard in the talks process, where people are not talking to each other. And it was, as Dr. Paisley would have said, a miracle in itself that ultimately these two came from hugely different backgrounds. Martin McGuinness and Ian Paisley came finally to do the deal. They both realized, and of course they're both dead now, that only by coming together would they ultimately solve this issue. And it is one of the most remarkable partnerships in modern history. And it worked.
Yeah, can I agree completely with Paul? He knew them better than I did, but it was a great loss after when they both died, because the stability of the peace process wasn't quite there as it had been when they were there. And I will say this about Martin McGuinness: he was very conciliatory. He condemned the Warrington bombing and things like that, and that's because he was known as a hard man, and therefore nobody could really touch him. He was a hard man, and he proved that being a hard man, you could also be very conciliatory. So he played a very important part. But I mean, Paisley did as well. And people like that are all part of the history.
Thank you. Louise, I know you've got to go soon, so I'm just going to hand over to you to wrap this up, and then I've got a last little bit at the end there.
Brilliant. Well, thanks, Paul. And just, I'm sure I speak for everyone in just enormous thanks to Alf, John and Paul for their reflections. It's been fascinating. And, many would be forgiven for thinking I've just set this all up just so I can listen. It gives me an excuse to listen to you guys this evening. It's been such an incredible insight into the history and, of course, the current context for all this. And I think that's a really nice question to end on, to think about the incredible bravery of the figures from the unionist and nationalist community in coming together to deliver on the peace. John Hume always said that respect for difference was the most abiding and fundamental principle of peace, and it's that has secured it. I think it's something that in our fractured politics today and across the world we could all learn from. I think there's an awful lot we can learn from in relation to Northern Ireland and the peace that was secured by the last Labour government. So thank you, all three of you. Thank you all so much for joining us. We've got 3 more webinars coming up, as I said earlier, over the next few months, particularly on the role of women and trade unionists, on lessons to be learned, and looking forward to the promise of peace for a new generation. So really looking forward to hearing from young people and what the agreement meant to them and what it means to them in their looking forward to their shared future now. So thank you again for joining us, and thanks again to Paul and all the staff for supporting this session today.
Fine. Thank you, Louise. I know you've got to go, and I'm just going to reiterate that our webpage will be updated at labour.org.uk/GFA. If you want to find out more about other Labour training, visit that as well. Email, it's gfa@labour.org.uk. We will be putting some resources together for our e-learning platform, achieve.labour.org.uk. So look out for all of those and those upcoming sessions on the 18th of Feb, 25th of March and the 8th of April. If you go onto the website, you'll be able to sign up for each of those individually as well. So that's it from us tonight. I'm not going to say much more, but thank you everyone as well. Thank you for joining us this evening. Good night, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good night. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Good night, all.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.